In 1982, east of Orlando, Florida, a man named Steve Vandeyot was operating a backhoe to prepare the ground for a new road. As he was turning the ground, a skull emerged from the peat of the swamp. The discovery of the skull sparked an archaeological expedition. After draining the Windover Bog swamp of its water, a sophisticated mass grave was revealed, and it contained 168 properly buried and well-preserved bodies. When the first skull was found, it was radiocarbon dated and evaluated to be approximately 7,000 years old. To put the age of the skull in perspective, this skull is 4,000 years older than the approximated age of the Great Pyramids in Egypt. The site became one of the most successful and academically interesting digs in the U.S. With the bodies, they found carefully carved wooden artifacts, antler tools, and bone tools, but the most interesting artifact was lots of hand-woven fabric. People were thought to be unsophisticated primitives thousands of years ago, and this fabric proved otherwise. To make complex tools and cloth material, these are skills that must be shared and passed down from generation to generation. To add to the sophistication of these people, men were buried with certain items such as tools, animal teeth, animal radiusawls, and atlatl spurs, which is a tool for spear throwing. Women were buried with more specific items such as incised bird bone tubes, which could be used as a type of straw or snare, and polished bone pins and beads made of drilled fish vertebrae. Of the 168 bodies, 91 of them remarkably still had brain tissue in their craniums. Naturally, the DNA of this tissue was tested.
Dr. Joe Lorenz of the Coriell Institute in Camden, New Jersey, is performing brand new analysis of the brain DNA, using techniques no one had access to back in the 1980s. Lorenz is re-examining sections of DNA called haplogroups in the brains of 5 Windover people. He's looking for haplogroups found only in native North Americans, because finding them would corroborate all previous work.
When I sequenced larger fragments and I was looking for the sites that I know are characteristic of Native American haplogroups, I was surprised because I did not find them.
In contrast to all previous findings, Lorenz couldn't confirm the Windover people were Americans. Further investigation revealed something even more remarkable.
I went back to the screen and I looked at the sequences again. The first person's DNA, it looked European. When I looked at the second one, it looked European. When I looked at the third, fourth, and fifth, they were slightly different from the first two, but they looked European.
Lorenz had found DNA unlike any other from Native Americans. Most scientists believe that some 15,000 years ago, people walked from Asia across the landmass now covered by the Bering Straits into North America. Lorenz's results could be consistent with a new and controversial theory that proposes some of the earliest people migrated to America from Europe, perhaps by crossing an Atlantic Ocean significantly narrower than it is today.
If our genetic analysis shows that these individuals really do belong to a new and previously unidentified lineage, founding lineage in the New World, it would be very big news.
So the race is on to find the final proof. But for the moment, Lorenz's work has added to the mounting evidence of an early European migration and stirred the controversy over the most extraordinary journey in human history.
Forensic anthropologists estimate ancestry using macromorphoscopic traits to determine trauma, age, sex, and controversially, ancestry. The only reason ancestral determination is the most controversial category here is because of its political charge, but truth cares not about political affiliation. There has been a laughable push in academia and political narrative to establish race purely as a social construct with no reliable ties to biology, which is simply not true. Facial and cranial features are heavily influenced by genetic phenotypes. There are indeed gray lines in this realm of science, but this gray line is not enough to dismiss the general categories of biological patterns in human phenotypes. Skeletal identification, particularly the skull, is very accurate and reliable with the right tools and methodologies. The National Center for Biotechnology Information claims metric techniques have also been used to determine race from the skull. Regression equations derived from measurements of the cranial base indicate a 70 to 90% accuracy for classifying blacks and whites, while multivariate discriminant functions for discriminating blacks, whites, and Native Americans correctly classify 82.6% of the males and 88.1% of the females. According to the Journal of Forensic Sciences, the overall rate of correct ancestry estimation from these cases is 90.9%, which is comparable to most research-derived rates and those reported by individual practitioners. Statistical tests showed no significant difference in accuracy rates depending on examiner education level or on the estimated or identified ancestry. With this in mind, I find it worth mentioning that one of the lead archaeologists of the site from the University of Florida, Professor Doran, wrote a book 393 pages long about the Windover Bog site and never mentioned the skulls or displayed any images of them. That being said, there are a few skulls we can look at now. There are 3 skulls from the Windover Bog site we're going to forensically examine with the tools we have using macromorphoscopic trait identification. At the Brevard Museum in Florida, we're going to be looking at their exhibit, or we're going to be looking at 2 of their exhibits. This will be the first one. We're going to be using this chart to be measuring and comparing the traits of the skulls there. I'm also going to be using this chart from the Smithsonian that compares European and American Indian characteristics. These are the 2 photos that we're going to be looking at specifically. So we have one that isn't quite a perfect profile picture, and then one that is about as a direct look at the front of the face. So we've got about 7 traits that we can look at. The first one being the eye. And as you can see, there's pretty distinct corners, and there's a fairly distinct slope here. So if we look at the charts here, the first one we can look at is the European one, where it does have these distinct corners and slope. The other one that may closely resemble is the East Asian, but East Asian seems to be a bit more rounded. The other closest one that it would look most similar to is the Native American eye socket right here. With the Native American, eye sockets are not quite as sloped as the European characteristics are. They have more rounded orbits. And label number 2 is outlining the cheekbone. As we can see here, the European cheekbones are very sharp and almost about at a 90-degree angle. Same with East Asian right here. The outside of their cheekbone seems to be a bit more prominent. And this is also a characteristic found in Native Americans. Now, since this isn't a perfectly centered picture, it may more closely match, once again, the European cheekbone structure. For the nasal cavity, it's difficult to tell because we can see here on the picture on the left, it's fairly jagged and rigid and appears to be damaged. So it's difficult to evaluate exactly what shape it has. And the shape that it has now, it does look more East Asian. It has more of the flared bottom to it. It's parallel to the vomer bone right here. So it's pretty much a toss-up between Native American, East Asian, and European. Number 4 is looking at the brow ridge right here, and as you can see, I have a green arrow pointing to this line right here where it curves over from the nasal bridge to the brow ridge. Now I placed it right here and gave a little wiggle room because I'm trying to center the line right in the center of the nasal bridge. Because if I measured it from where it is, we would be going over this part of the brow ridge right here. So as you can see, it takes a curved kind of shape at first over the brow ridge, and then it straightens back out a little more. And if we go and look at these comparisons for European, Africans, Asians, and Australian Aborigines, you can see on the European it curves and then it straightens back out. With Africans, it's fairly straight and then it curves slightly. With East Asian, it's got more of a acute, an obtuse curve to it, and then it straightens back out a little bit at the end. So again, I think this more closely matches the European phenotype. And then if we look at the actual shape of the skull, it's very rounded out. And then in the profile angle on the left, it's fairly round as well. It's a bit difficult to tell because they're all very similar, especially the European East Asian. But if we go back and we look at the American Indian characteristics from the Smithsonian and the European characteristics from the Smithsonian, you can see the European has more of a rounded shape to it, and the American Indian has a bit more of defined angles, and it's a bit more blocky in a sense. And if we look at the skull from the front, it appears to be more curved. So again, I would say this is more of a European characteristic. Also, with my other green arrow right here, the skull either had a pretty bad underbite, or it's clearly damaged right here, and the mandible has shifted forward. So if we were going to measure the prognathism, which is this down here, measuring from the brow ridge to the front of the maxilla, and then to the chin. It's kind of difficult to see, but there are red lines measuring from the maxilla to the bottom of the chin for each of these. And that angle kind of determines the kind of V shape on African, East Asian, and Australian Aborigines. Europeans generally don't have prognathism. It's usually generally straight and flat-faced. And here it's difficult to tell because, again, this isn't a perfect side profile of this picture. But if this mandible shifted back to where maybe the teeth were straight, and we had a better side profile, I believe it looks as if there's no prognathism. Okay. So let's go on to the next slide. We're going to be looking at this skull right here. This is also in the same museum. So we have two angles of it that I could find. Label number 1, again, is the eye socket. This one appears to be a bit more rounded. It's difficult to see if there's any corners, but you can kind of see right here. There's a corner here, and there's a corner here, and then a corner here. And you can see the general slope. So we have the slope and the corners. I would rule out, at least on this chart, African, East Asian, and Australian Aborigines. I'd lean more towards European once again. The nasal cavity is also in really good shape. Unfortunately, there's not a direct angle to look at the nasal cavity and its true shape, but it appears to be fairly triangular. It's very flat on the vomer bone. The only one that is flat is European, and if we go back to the Smithsonian chart, Native American is also fairly flat, so it would come down to European and Native American. Native American is supposed to have a bit more of a flare out at the bottom next to the vomer bone, so I would personally lean towards more of a European characteristic. Let's see, number 3, looking at the cheekbone again. Again, we see kind of this almost 90-degree angle right here. The cheekbones don't appear to be very obtuse or prominent. So again, I'd lean towards European with this one as well. Number 4, there's no prognathism from the ridge brow to the maxilla right here to the chin. It's a fairly flat face. Again, would give that to a European characteristic. And same with the nasal bridge. It's very flat right here, and then it angles up just a bit. And if you look at the brow ridge, it has that curve, and then it flattens back out after the ridge brow. And again, I think this most closely matches a European characteristic trait. And then number 7 with the actual shape of the skull or the cranium. Once again, it's kind of difficult to tell exactly what shape. There's not a whole lot to really look out for. European and East Asian are very, very similar. So it would come down to just those two. And if we go back and look at the Native American chart, the curve is also very similar. Between European and Native American characteristic traits. Okay, next slide is the first image that was released. I believe it was back in the 80s. There was an author that wanted to write about the whole archaeological dig. So there's a little information we can extract from this photo, but it's not the best quality photo. So we'll have to take all this with fairly a grain of salt. So let's look at the the eye socket once again. Once again, we can see there's a slope. There are corners that are pretty distinct. We can see, that it's sloped. Very similar to European characteristics, once again, or Native American. It'd come down to those two. It's difficult to tell which one from this picture. Number 2 with the cheekbones, once again, you can see this almost kind of 90-degree angle. I tried to trace the cheekbone lines as best I could. And they don't seem like they're very obtuse. And can't quite see this one over here. It doesn't seem to be poking out too much. So once again, I would be leaning toward European, toward those types. With the nasal bridge, it's a bit difficult to tell, but again, I tried to trace the lines as best I could. It's got kind of a zigzag formation to it. And if we go and look at this chart right here, according to this chart, I believe it most closely matches European once again. It's the only one on the right side that has this kind of zigzaggy formation to it. None of the other ones seem to have that zigzag, except for maybe, what is this one, African? But the nasal cavity it's so damaged. It's very difficult to tell what shape it has, and the quality of the photo is so poor. It's very difficult to tell, so I didn't even bother to try and evaluate it. Number 4, we're looking at the distance between the nasal bridge, and the brow ridge. And I drew these lines kind of comparing the height right here and then the top of the eye socket to the nasal bridge right here. Reason being is because, let's see, if you look at this photo right here, the sort of peak of the nasal bridge is not perfectly parallel, but it's very close to the top of the eye socket. East Asians, there seems to be much higher up here. Same with, Africans right here. Same with East Asians, it seems to be higher right here. And then with Aborigines, it's fairly close, similar to Europeans, but I think it's pretty clear we're not looking at an Aborigine skull. So, if we go back once again to the Smithsonian chart, it's a bit difficult to tell, but it's pretty much the same for Aborigines, for Native American characteristics. So it would once again come down to Native American and European traits. Just to be clear, I want to reiterate that I am aware that this is not a scientifically proper forensic evaluation of macromorphoscopic traits. This was simply my evaluation of images with the tools that I have with me. That being said, I wanted to follow this science as closely as I could to try and bring more clarification on the ancestral identification of these Windover Bog remains. The clip I showed earlier reports the haplogroups measured were of European ancestry, while modern-day reports claim they are of Native American ancestry. Because of this, there is a split among the scientific and public consensus of the DNA, and it has left me and many others curious as to what the truth is. As many of such cases are, the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. The earliest known origin of Native American ancestry is found in the DNA of a Siberian boy, or the Malta boy, who died 24,000 years ago and shares 14 to 38% of the ancestry of Native Americans. In addition, this genetic data seems to support the land bridge theory between Siberia and the New World. The boy's Y DNA, which is DNA from the lineage of females, is also the earliest known find of the haplogroup R1. This haplogroup is most frequently found in West Northern Europeans. The Siberian boy has no genetic relationship to East Asians, which has brought a lot of confusion to anthropologists. BBC News report on this finding, quote, "With these remains of a young kid were all sorts of cultural items, one of which was a Venus figurine," lead researcher S.K. Willerslev from the University of Copenhagen told the Nature podcast. These Venus figurines are found all the way west of this area into Europe. Dr. Willerslev and a colleague obtained a sample from the boy's arm bone, extracted DNA, and compared it with that of present-day populations. The most puzzling part of this finding was that the boy showed no clear affinities with East Asian populations, such as the Chinese, Koreans, or Japanese. Today's Native Americans are most closely related to East Asians, so the scientists had to work out how the Malta boy could be related to indigenous Americans, but not to East Asians. The most likely scenario, they argue, is that a population like the one living in Siberia 24,000 years ago mixed with the ancestors of East Asians at some point after the boy died. Native Americans are composed of the meeting of the two populations, an East Asian group and these Malta West Eurasian populations, said Dr. Willerslev. However, it remains unclear where this mixing took place. It could have happened in the Old World, somewhere in Siberia, obviously, or, in principle, it could also have happened in the New World, he explained. The most direct way to address this question would be to genome sequence some of the early skeletons from the Americas. If they already have the mixture of East Asians and the Malta, then we know it happened before that. The research could help explain some long-standing anomalies in the study of Native American origins. For example, some early American skeletons, such as the 9,000-year-old Kennewick man from Washington State, bear physical features that, according to some, are typical of Europeans, and unlike those of modern Native American groups or East Asians. If you enjoy my work, please consider subscribing, liking the video, or making a donation. All those links can be found in the description. As always, thanks an awful lot for listening.